I never got used to sleeping alone. Even after a full year without Emily beside me, I still reached for her in the middle of the night, my fingers brushing against nothing but cold sheets and the weight of silence pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. I told myself that grief did this to people, that the mind struggled to accept emptiness where there was once warmth, but the nights were the worst. In the dark, memories became ghosts, shadows stretching across the walls, the faint scent of her lavender shampoo lingering just long enough to make me doubt my own sanity. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the eerie stillness of the house that once felt like a home. But last night was different. Last night, something whispered my name. And it wasn't just a fleeting sound in my half-asleep state, it was clear, deliberate, just inches from my ear. It sounded like Emily. At first, I thought I had imagined it, that exhaustion and the cruel tricks of loneliness had manifested her voice from the depths of my subconscious. But then I heard it again, soft yet unmistakable, drawn out in a breathy exhale, Daniel. My body locked up, a cold shiver crawling up my spine as I fumbled for the bedside lamp, my fingers shaking as they found the switch. The room flooded with light, revealing nothing but the familiar emptiness of my bedroom. The door was shut. The windows were locked. I was alone. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my skull as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe I had been dreaming, caught in that strange limbo between sleep and wakefulness where the mind conjures sounds and voices. Maybe it was the house settling, the wind outside, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. But none of those explanations could account for the one undeniable truth that made my blood run cold: the voice hadn't come from across the room. It had come from the empty side of the bed. I barely slept after that, my body frozen in place, ears straining for any sound, any movement. Every tick of the clock on the wall felt like a gunshot in the quiet, my breath uneven, my skin clammy with sweat. And yet, no matter how much I tried to push it away, to tell myself it had been nothing, a hallucination born from sorrow, a deeper fear took root inside me. Because as the minutes dragged into hours, a single, horrifying realization settled into my bones, sending my mind spiraling into the abyss of something I didn't want to believe. That voice, it hadn't been distorted. It hadn't been muffled or distant. It had been crystal clear, as though Emily were right there beside me, her lips against my ear. Whispering. Calling for me. And the worst part? She sounded like she was smiling. I didn't want to sleep. The thought of closing my eyes, of drifting into that vulnerable space where reality blurred with nightmares, made my stomach twist with something deeper than fear, something primal, something that whispered in the back of my mind that I was no longer alone. But exhaustion is cruel, and no matter how hard I fought it, my body betrayed me. The weight of fatigue settled into my bones, dragging me down, my eyelids growing heavier with each passing minute. I kept the bedside lamp on, its pale glow barely reaching the corners of the room, where shadows stretched unnaturally, shifting as though they were alive. I told myself it was just paranoia, that grief had twisted my senses, making me hear things that weren't there. But when I finally succumbed to sleep, the whisper came again. Louder this time. Closer. Daniel. I jolted awake, gasping, my body drenched in cold sweat. The room was thick with silence, yet the weight of something unseen pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. My fingers gripped the sheets, my pulse hammering so violently that I could hear it in my ears. I forced myself to move, to sit up, my heart slamming against my ribs as I scanned the room. The door was still closed. The windows were locked. But something was wrong. The air was different, thicker, charged with an almost electric tension, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. I could feel it, that terrible sensation of being watched, the unmistakable awareness of another presence in the room. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out. But I couldn't. Something held me there, something unseen, something that made my skin crawl with an icy dread I had never known before. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A soft, slow exhale. Right next to me. The breath was warm against my neck. I flung myself out of bed, stumbling backward so fast that I nearly tripped over the rug. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I pressed myself against the wall. The bed was empty. The room was still. But the presence lingered, thick and suffocating, a force that pressed into my skull, whispering, whispering, whispering. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, but all I could hear was Emily's voice, filling the room with something that should not have been possible. And then I saw it, the imprint on the bed. The shape of a body lying beside where I had been just moments ago. The sheets, smooth just seconds before, were now indented, the unmistakable curve of a human form pressing into the mattress. The indentation deepened, as if something unseen was shifting, moving. And then, as I watched in frozen horror, I saw the pillow beside mine slowly, deliberately, sink inward, as if someone were laying their head down to rest. It all started the night I moved into that old house at the edge of town, the kind of place that carries the weight of forgotten stories, its walls soaked with decades of whispers. The air inside felt thick, almost viscous, as if something unseen lingered just beyond the corner of my vision, watching, waiting. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I had just gone through a messy breakup and needed a fresh start. But as I stood in the dimly lit hallway, my bag still unpacked, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, a deep groan echoing through the hollow corridors, as though the house itself exhaled. Then, the lights flickered, not the casual flutter of old wiring, but a slow, deliberate pulse, like something alive was breathing in tandem with my own erratic heartbeat. That first night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the soft, deliberate scratching coming from inside the walls, a slow, rhythmic scrape that sent chills down my spine. I convinced myself it was just mice. Old houses always have pests, but the sound was too precise, too calculated. At around 3 a.m., I woke to an icy draft rolling over my body, despite the windows being firmly shut. My breath curled in the air, visible as though I were standing outside in the dead of winter, and that's when I saw it, the silhouette at the foot of my bed. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I wanted to scream, but my voice had been stolen from me, trapped in my throat by an unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, it just stood there, watching. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, leaving only the suffocating silence and the undeniable sensation that something had changed. The following days were worse. Objects moved on their own, small at first, a book shifting slightly on the table, a chair nudged out of place, but then, more obvious. I'd find my keys in the freezer, the television turning on at full volume in the middle of the night, drawers yanked open as if someone had been searching for something with frantic desperation. But it wasn't until the mirror incident that I truly understood the horror I had invited into my life. One evening, while brushing my teeth, I glanced up to see my reflection smiling, a wide, grotesque grin stretching across my face, only, I wasn't smiling. My stomach dropped, my hands went cold, and before I could react, my own reflection whispered, in a voice that wasn't mine, "You let me in." The room went dark, the mirror shattered, and in that moment, I knew, this thing, whatever it was, had no intention of letting me leave alive. The nights became unbearable. Sleep was no longer a refuge but a battleground where I fought to keep my sanity from slipping into the abyss that had taken root in my home. The whispers no longer confined themselves to the darkest hours, they seeped into my waking life, a constant murmur at the edge of my consciousness. I would be making coffee, the scent of roasted beans filling the air, only to hear my name rasped in a voice that was both distant and intimately close. The walls of the house pulsed, their very structure groaning under the weight of something unseen yet undeniably present. The worst part wasn't the whispers or the shifting shadows, it was the laughter, hollow and mocking, as if whatever had attached itself to me took perverse joy in my unraveling fear. Desperation drove me to record the strange occurrences. Armed with my phone, I set it on my nightstand and let it run as I tried, futilely, to sleep. When I played it back the next morning, my blood turned to ice. The whispers were there, clearer than before, weaving through the silence like insidious threads pulling tighter around my mind. But this time, it wasn't just my name being uttered in that breathy, almost reverent tone. It was Emily's. Over and over again, the voice called for her, as if summoning something long forgotten. My hands trembled as I increased the volume, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged beast. The recording crackled, warped, and then, unmistakably, I heard my own voice, except I had never spoken those words. "She's waiting. Let her in." Panic clawed at my throat, my vision tunneling as the implications crashed down on me like a tidal wave. How could this thing know about Emily? How could it mimic my voice with such chilling accuracy? I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to get out. My fingers fumbled as I yanked open drawers, searching for my car keys. But just as my hand closed around the cold metal, the room plunged into darkness. The temperature plummeted, and in the suffocating silence, a whisper slithered through the blackness, close enough that I could feel the damp breath against my ear. Too late. The door slammed shut behind me, locking me in. And as I turned, the mirror across the room flickered to life, reflecting not my own terrified face, but Emily's, her expression twisted in agony, her mouth forming silent words I couldn't understand. The lights exploded, shards of glass slicing through the air, and in the ensuing chaos, I understood one thing with horrifying certainty: Emily had never truly left. And now, neither could I. The house had changed. I could feel it in the way the air pressed against my skin, thick and electric, like the charged stillness before a violent storm. Every night, the walls seemed to breathe, exhaling whispers that slithered through the darkness and wrapped around my consciousness like a living entity. Sleep had become a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time my eyes fluttered closed, something shifted in the shadows, something that watched, something that waited. The floorboards groaned beneath invisible weight, doors slammed shut with no explanation, and the mirrors, God, the mirrors, had become a portal to something far worse than my reflection. I had tried to leave once, had bolted for the front door with my heart hammering against my ribs, only to find myself standing back inside, my hand still gripping the doorknob as a slow, taunting chuckle echoed from the walls. Then, the dreams started. Or maybe they weren't dreams at all. Each night, I was paralyzed in my bed, my limbs heavy as if submerged in tar, my breath shallow and desperate. The entity would come, shifting in and out of the darkness, its form barely perceptible, yet suffocating in its presence. I could never see it fully, only glimpses, the elongated fingers curling around my bedpost, the jagged teeth flashing in the void where a face should be, the glistening, blackened skin that seemed to pulse with unnatural life. It would lean closer, its breath cold and rancid against my ear, whispering words in a language I didn't understand, yet their meaning clawed its way into my mind: "You belong to me now." I tried to fight it, to resist its grip on my sanity, but it was burrowing deeper, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every passing night. Objects weren't just moving anymore, they were reacting to me, responding as though the house itself was alive and aware of my presence. My phone screen flickered erratically, displaying messages I had never typed: "Don't run. Don't fight. Accept it." The voices no longer whispered, they screamed, a deafening chorus of agony that rattled inside my skull. The entity was no longer just watching, it was inside me, twisting its way into my very essence. I could feel it when I blinked, when I swallowed, when I breathed. And then, one night, I woke up to find my own hands wrapped around my throat, squeezing, as a voice that wasn't mine whispered in my ear, "Let me in." I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat as the shadowed figure loomed at the foot of my bed. The dim glow from the streetlight outside barely illuminated its grotesque form, twisted, elongated limbs and a head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken and never set properly. It did not move, did not breathe, yet I could feel it watching me with an intensity that sent icy tendrils of dread curling around my spine. My fingers trembled as I clutched the edge of my blanket, torn between the primal instinct to hide and the overwhelming certainty that this thing would not be deterred by something as feeble as fabric. Then, without warning, it took a single step forward. The floor did not creak. The air did not shift. It was as if it moved through space in a way that defied natural law, a flickering presence between the tangible and something far, far worse. Panic surged through me in electric bursts. My mind screamed at me to run, to move, to do anything but stay trapped in this paralyzing fear, yet my body refused to obey. The figure's elongated fingers twitched, convulsing in a sickeningly rhythmic motion, as if it were flexing for the first time in centuries. My pulse pounded against my skull, each beat a deafening drum that I was sure it could hear. Then came the sound, a guttural, wet clicking noise that started low in its throat and escalated into something resembling human speech but entirely wrong, as if it were mimicking a voice it had once known but had long since forgotten how to use. "You shouldn't be here." The words were slow, deliberate, each syllable stretching far longer than was natural. The breath behind them reeked of decay, of something ancient and rotting, something that should never have been given a voice. My muscles finally snapped free from their paralysis, and I bolted upright, but the second I moved, it lunged. The darkness swallowed me whole as I felt its icy grip clamp around my wrist. It was like plunging into an abyss, a place where time and reality dissolved into a chaotic void. The room twisted, the walls stretching into infinity, warping like a reflection in shattered glass. I could hear whispers, thousands of voices speaking at once, overlapping in a cacophony of fear and agony. They begged, they pleaded, they screamed for release, for mercy, for something I could not understand. The thing yanked me forward, its strength beyond human, its grip digging deep enough into my flesh that I felt the bones strain under the pressure. My vision blurred, the world around me disintegrating into a swirling nightmare of shadows and disjointed horrors. I was falling into nothingness, into a place where no one could hear me scream. And then, just as the last shred of reality threatened to slip away, I heard something else, a voice not from the abyss, but from the waking world. My name. It was being called, desperately, urgently. A sharp, burning light cut through the darkness, searing into my eyes, pulling me back from the precipice. I gasped, my lungs filling with air as I crashed back into my body, back into my room, back into a reality that suddenly felt more fragile than ever. The figure was gone. But the mark on my wrist remained, a deep, black imprint that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. And in my mind, the whispers had not stopped. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light, it was alive, shifting and breathing, pressing against me like an unseen force that whispered my name with every flicker of shadow. The room around me had changed, it no longer resembled the space I had once known. The walls pulsed as if they were the inside of some great, slumbering beast, their texture damp and unnervingly organic. A deep, guttural sound vibrated through the floor beneath my feet, resonating in my bones, an inhuman growl that sent ice through my veins. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse hammering in my throat as I took a step forward, my bare foot sinking into something soft and warm. I didn't want to look down. I knew, somehow, I knew, that seeing what lay beneath me would shatter the fragile grip I had on my sanity. But curiosity, that insidious and treacherous impulse, forced my gaze downward. The floor was no longer solid wood but a pulsating, fleshy mass, slick with something thick and dark that reeked of copper and decay. My foot had sunken into what felt like muscle, a writhing, living thing that reacted to my touch with a slow, sluggish twitch. I jerked my leg back, bile rising in my throat, and turned wildly to find a way out. But the door was gone. In its place, an opening had appeared, a jagged maw lined with what looked like splintered teeth, gaping hungrily at me. The air around it pulsed with a sickly, humid breath, and from within the darkness of its depths, something shifted, something massive. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body was paralyzed, caught between terror and disbelief. Then, a whisper slithered through the air, curling around me like a serpent, you've come so far. Don't leave now. A hand, if it could even be called that, emerged from the darkness, long fingers stretching toward me, skin gray and stretched too tight over bones that jutted at unnatural angles. The nails were blackened and cracked, and as they reached for me, I saw something moving beneath the skin, something wriggling, pushing outward as if trying to break free. I screamed, the sound raw and desperate, but no echo came. The walls absorbed the noise, swallowing my terror whole. And then, with a wet, sucking sound, the hand extended further, its fingers elongating unnaturally, stretching toward my face with agonizing slowness. The whisper came again, closer this time, rasping against my ear in a voice that did not belong to this world. You are already part of it. There's no escape now. The wind outside howled with an unnatural intensity, rattling the thin glass of the motel window as I sat on the edge of the stained mattress, gripping my phone with trembling fingers. The screen had gone dark again, the cryptic message from the unknown number vanishing as though it had never existed, leaving behind nothing but an eerie emptiness in my gut. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave this place immediately, but the moment I reached for my suitcase, the lights flickered, then died altogether, plunging the room into an oppressive darkness that seemed to breathe. The air thickened, pressing against my skin, and in that suffocating silence, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something shifting beneath the bed, the slow drag of brittle nails against the wooden floor, deliberate and agonizingly slow, as if whatever was lurking there wanted me to know it was aware of my presence. A sharp, metallic taste flooded my mouth as I bit down on my tongue to keep from making a sound. My mind raced, flipping through every possible explanation, every rational thought dissolving under the weight of pure, undiluted fear. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body frozen in place, caught between the primal instinct to flee and the terrifying certainty that any sudden movement might trigger whatever nightmare was hiding inches away from my feet. Then, just as I forced myself to lean forward, to maybe stand and bolt for the door, the mattress above me shifted ever so slightly, as though something underneath it had moved, pushing up against my weight. A cold, skeletal hand, impossibly long fingers curled inward like the brittle legs of a spider, emerged from the shadows beneath, stopping mere inches from my ankle, motionless, waiting. My stomach twisted violently as I felt a whisper of air against my exposed skin, something exhaling, deliberate and too close. With every ounce of courage I could muster, I lurched forward, stumbling toward the motel door, my fingers fumbling desperately with the chain lock, my pulse hammering so loudly in my ears that I barely registered the slow creak of the bed frame behind me. The light from the hallway bled into the room as I yanked the door open, and in that split second, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The bed was empty. The hand was gone. But on the wall opposite, where my reflection should have been in the dusty mirror, stood a figure, a twisted, emaciated thing with hollowed-out eyes, its face a distorted mockery of my own. It grinned, a wide, gaping smile filled with rows of jagged, needle-like teeth, and in a voice that did not belong to me, it whispered my name. The silence in the house was deceptive, a stillness that seemed to creep into my very bones, wrapping around my chest like a vice. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I pressed my back against the damp, rotting wood of the basement wall, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something far worse, something metallic, like rusted iron, like blood. I had heard the door upstairs slam shut on its own, followed by the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps descending the wooden stairs, one at a time. The pattern was wrong, though. The steps were uneven, as if something with an unnatural gait was creeping down toward me. I could see the shadows shifting, long fingers stretching across the floor, reaching for me. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms, but the pain wasn't enough to anchor me in reality. Because reality had shattered the moment I realized I was no longer alone. A whisper, raspy and barely audible, slithered through the air, curling around my ears like tendrils of cold mist. It spoke my name. No, it didn't just speak it, it breathed it, exhaled it as if my very existence was being acknowledged by something that shouldn't exist. My vision blurred with terror as I forced myself to peek around the stack of old, crumbling cardboard boxes. And there it was. A figure, hunched and grotesque, its limbs too long, too thin, its skin sagging in places where it shouldn't. Its eyes, oh God, its eyes were nothing but gaping, endless voids, absorbing the dim light of the basement, swallowing it whole. It didn't move like a person, it twitched, convulsed, every jerk of its body making a sickening, wet sound, like flesh peeling away from bone. I wanted to scream, but my throat had locked up, betraying me. My body refused to move. All I could do was watch as it raised one claw-like hand, its fingers stretching unnaturally long, curling toward me, beckoning. And then, it grinned. A mouth too wide, teeth too sharp, a chasm of darkness that promised horrors beyond my comprehension. I don't remember how I found the strength to move, but suddenly I was running. My legs pumped furiously beneath me as I darted through the labyrinth of forgotten junk, my mind screaming for escape. I reached the stairs, my hands gripping the wooden railing so tight that splinters dug into my skin. As I climbed, I felt the presence behind me, so close I could almost feel its breath against the back of my neck. The air turned frigid, and a force, invisible but suffocating, pressed against me, urging me to stop, to succumb, to let the darkness consume me. But I didn't. I reached the door at the top, yanked it open, and threw myself into the hallway, slamming it shut just as a guttural, inhuman shriek tore through the basement. The walls shuddered with the force of it, and for a second, I was sure the entire house would collapse in on itself. But then, silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of waiting. Full of watching. I pressed my forehead against the door, my breath ragged, my heartbeat a deafening drum in my ears. I knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. Because whatever that thing was, it had found me. And it wasn't going to stop until I was no longer part of this world. I stood in the midst of this otherworldly gloom, feeling the skin on my arms become covered with orphan skin, and my heart trying to break through my ribs, trying to escape from my chest. What I saw in front of me could not be explained by logic or common sense, but it was happening, it was real. On the wall, right in front of me, something was moving. Like living flesh, it pulsed and wriggled, creating terrible shapes that resembled human faces screaming in silent terror. Their eyes, huge, black, bottomless, looked directly at me, and there was something primitive, ancient in their gaze, something that had no right to exist in our world. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a terrible, gnashing sound that made me shudder. Dark, thick tears began to flow out of the wall, spreading across the floor like molten wax. They crawled to my feet, and I took a step back, but the room seemed to shrink, forcing me to stay where I was. I felt something cold and sticky touch my skin, and at that moment my whole world collapsed. Right out of that pulsating wall, hands began to come out, thin, with long, twisted fingers, like the bony paws of the dead. They were reaching out to me, wanting to grab me, to pull me in, to tear me out of reality into a place where time, light, and life no longer exist. I screamed, but my voice was lost in this gloom, dissolved in the terrible, hopeless moans of the creatures that lived in the walls. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, I could only feel hands touching my face, neck, sliding over my shoulders, squeezing me in iron captivity. And then, right in front of my eyes, one of the heads that was poking through the wall opened its mouth. It was not a human mouth, it was a hole leading to endless darkness. And from that abyss, from that empty, terrifying abyss, a terrible whisper came out. It was calling me, saying my name. And I knew that if I heard it completely, if I allowed those words to penetrate my consciousness, I would no longer exist. I would cease to exist. I would become one of them.